Thanks, everybody, for taking the time out at the end of the school year. I know it's a busy time, so I really appreciate it. So this is work with Andrew Penner and Thad Domina, a lot of the stuff I've been fortunate enough to do here at Stanford has really benefited from close collaborations with school district research partners. And this project is kind of similar to that in that we use school district administrative data, but a lot of the stuff that we've been doing here at Stanford has been with a tight partnership where a district research partner will come up with a policy that they want evaluated. But this is actually sort of a different case here. This is what we sort of refer to and what anthropologists might refer to as a gift from the field. So back in 2011, 2012, Thad, my co-author, was sitting at his desk and he got a phone call from a reporter. And this reporter said, do you have a comment on this story? Have you heard about this school district nearby? They're implementing this policy where they're giving students color-coded IDs to try to improve achievement. And Thad thought to himself and said, I need to think about what I think might happen here. And he hung up the phone and he said, I'll call you back. So he called me and Andrew and said, what do you think about this policy? What's going on? Do you think that this would be a positive thing or a negative thing? How do I give them a quote that doesn't make me, sway the sort of decision-making here one way or the other? And we talked about it for a while, and he kind of came away with the idea that, like, I need to say something that gives them a comment, but that leaves the door open for us to study this. And by the time he called back, they had already gotten a quote from someone else. So he never got quoted, and in fact, the person who did get quoted left them with the really glorious quote that said, expert horrified. So it's in that context that we set out trying to study what happened in this district. This district had organized its students to try to improve achievement, like so many districts do. But they, instead of trying to motivate students and teachers with some sort of coordinated structure that targeted something at the school level, this went right to the students and tried to incentivize them to try harder in a kind of a novel way that used a prize system. And prizes are used in a whole lot of different settings. Prizes are a formal system that allocate rewards for exemplary behavior. In a whole different host of areas, they articulate a vision of excellence, and then they encourage people to pursue that vision. So in the arts, we try to encourage people to make great movies and write good songs. In the sciences, we give away Nobel Prizes to try to incentivize people to solve difficult problems. In elementary school, we have kids participate in spelling bees to try to motivate them to learn to become better readers. And in sports, we give away prizes to teams that are the best. Hopefully, we'll give one to the Warriors maybe in a couple of weeks. We use prizes all over the place to try to organize fields and to try to motivate people towards a central goal. And they've proliferated all over the place. But even as we organize people in this way, prizes have consequences for the people who get them, who are the winners, and the people who don't get them, who are the losers. In designating someone a winner versus a loser, we construct and perpetuate social inequalities, even as we can reinforce behaviors that we ultimately sometimes actually really value and like. And there's a lot of different theoretical discussions about things like prizes. Instead of using the language of prizes, some disciplines use the language of incentives or rewards or distinction. But a bunch of different disciplines have a lot to say about how important and how influential and how useful prizes can be. So even going back to fundamental principles of economics, one of Mankiw's core 10 principles is that individuals respond to incentives. Some other economists have taken a little bit of a more nuanced view to try to explain how that might work. And they use a social psychologist's framework of a looking glass self, where an individual will learn information from getting a reward or maybe not getting a reward. And then they'll infer some signal about their own ability, and then they'll adjust the amount of effort that they're willing to exert in the future as a result of whether or not they got that reward or prize. So that's kind of where economics leaves it, and in general, they sort of encourage the use of incentives to motivate behavior. In contrast, at least some groups of psychologists, especially more in the developmental psychology end and social psychology end, have some more suspicions about prizes and rewards. DC and Ryan have been thinking about extrinsic rewards, which are outside rewards that you give to people to try to motivate their behavior in a certain way, and the kinds of effects that it might have on a student's intrinsic or internal motivation towards pursuing some kind of learning. And they say things like the following as a conclusion from their research on this topic. Tangible rewards, both material rewards, such as pizza parties for reading books, and symbolic rewards, such as good student awards, are widely advocated by many educators and are used in many classrooms. Yet the evidence suggests that these rewards tend to undermine intrinsic motivation for the rewarded activity, which is almost the opposite of what they want people to think when they're trying to motivate them to learn something. And then sociologists have some thoughts about what happens when we give distinctions to different people for the kinds of behaviors that we like and when we give rewards. So Bourdieu has thought a lot about the ways in which we categorize people and give signals to others about how much we value them and how we use prizes to actually try to perpetuate inequalities that already exist. And he talks about the social magic that always manages to produce discontinuity out of continuity. The paradigmatic example of this is the competitive academic examination. Between the last person to pass and the first person to fail, the competitive examination creates differences of all or nothing that can last a lifetime. So this is perhaps a little fatalistic in terms of the kinds of outcomes that can happen from a single prize, but in some cases, this can actually be true. Getting a prize can make or break someone's career, and not getting it can leave them left behind. So prizes are embedded in a lot of different education policies right now. The US Department of Education uses Race to the Top competitions to try to incentivize states to change their policies. It gives multi-billion-dollar awards to states that most align their policy directions with what the US Department of Ed thinks aligns with good teaching. Earlier iterations of school accountability under No Child Left Behind focused teachers and schools on kids who were really close to proficiency thresholds, which led to educational triage in some cases. Some of Tom's work and work of others looks at the ways in which we use financial incentives to try to get teachers to promote achievement in their schools. And then at the post-secondary level, we use merit-based financial aid to give resources to kids to try to woo them to our schools and celebrate the ways in which they've excelled academically, even if they don't necessarily need the financial rewards to be able to afford college. And in this context, increasingly, schools and teachers are being defined by their students' test scores. And in some of those cases that I mentioned earlier, we actually like the things that the incentives are doing and that the prizes are promoting people to try to do. But we also have heard stories of ways in which some of those prizes and incentives have motivated behaviors that we don't necessarily want to promote. Like, for example, in the Atlanta cheating scandal. Apparently, in the middle of all of this, there was an awards reception for schools that had been successful in promoting student achievement. And one principal recounts being one of the non-celebrated schools. The schools that had academic distinctions got to go down onto the field of a football stadium and get celebrated. And all the schools that hadn't made sufficient progress had to sit up in the bleachers and watch. And they felt ostracized. And one principal discussed it as getting leprosy. It was like having leprosy in the Bible. So people internalize the signals that we give. That may be a little extreme, no doubt. But they internalize the signals that we get from prizes and incentives and the ways that we distinguish people with them. And then closer to home, of course, we're also really familiar with what happened in the wake of the LA Times releasing value-added estimates and the stigma that it left some educators feeling when they were deemed least effective. So all of these things are kind of floating around in the air as this particular set of schools embarked upon their policy. So this study evaluates a school-based prize system that was implemented in a Southern California high school district. It examines the impact of a social incentive designed to motivate students to increase their test performance. And the thing about this policy is that it kind of worked. On average, achievement went up in these high schools, much more than it did in the comparison high schools nearby that didn't have the policy. But at the same time as it motivated a lot of students to improve their efforts on these tests, it also created new inequalities between students who got the high status prizes and the students who missed out on getting those prizes. And it created new status distinctions within the high school that were sort of internalized into the dialogue and the culture of these schools. And these status-based incentives then created categorical inequalities that didn't exist before. It identified some kids as winners and some kids as losers. And so even as the principles reoriented student behavior towards their intended goal, it had this iatrogenic effect on some students in particular. So I want to just point out that these are status incentives, which is a little different than a financial incentive that has been examined in some other settings where people have paid students to try to improve test performance. These two schools used status incentives because they were working in a setting in which they had really diffuse authority. They were really worried that students weren't trying hard enough on tests, but they didn't have any money to pay them to try harder, so they had to come up with a social strategy to motivate their behavior. And for these principles, this kind of approach seemed really cost-free. And so what we were curious about was to examine whether or not that was actually the case. So in the fall of 2010 and the fall of 2011, two high schools in Sudden Valley Unified, which is in California, at Live Oak and Mann high schools, which are not their real names, designed an incentive system where they assigned students ID cards based on their prior year CST scores. So based on whichever score you scored the lowest on in the prior year, that led to your assignment to a particular card. There's a few other caveats that I'll explain as I go on, but in general, this was in the era when CSTs had those 5 performance bands. The highest was advanced, then proficient, then basic, below basic, and far below basic. So if your lowest score was far below basic, below basic, or basic, the lowest 3, then you got a white card. If your lowest score was not in any of those 3 categories, but in proficient, then you got a gold card. And if all of your scores were in the highest category, in advanced, you got a platinum card. So this particular woman's card doesn't come with a discount, but sometimes they do. And this platinum card, or the gold card before it, entitled you to certain privileges. But students were required to carry these cards around with them everywhere. And they had to carry around a matching homework planner. This gal, who's an actual student from one of these schools, looks thrilled. And the planners, they promoted this focus on achievement. They even had the API score of the school on the front to try to get kids engaged in trying harder on the test. And when they rolled them out, the principals went around and they had this slide deck that they went through in every homeroom class to try to tell kids what the system was going to be. And then they had banners up in the hallways in the schools to promote the whole system. They borrowed from credit card slogans, and they said, gold card, don't leave home without it. Platinum card, membership has its privileges. And they tried to instill in the students the close connection between effort on the test and the incentive system that they used. So in addition to this sort of social structure that tried to motivate kids to try hard and that gave them a very public designation of what their status was based on their prior achievement, they also got a couple of other external rewards related to it. They got things like discounts to school events like football games and dances. They got special awards banquets to celebrate them. These are kind of typical like honor roll sort of things. They got discounted class rings and some other kind of small things that maybe had a slight monetary cost but were pretty minimal otherwise. But the one that ultimately got them into trouble was the following. They also gave kids an express lunch line where they could show their gold or platinum card and get in a line that was faster and get through lunch more quickly. And so there's this picture that came out in the media of these 2 lines. And as you can imagine, the odds of getting a different one of these more higher status cards was somewhat associated with some existing social inequities, including, of course, race, ethnic background. And so there's these pictures in the media of 2 lines with somewhat different phenotypic makeups in them, which should have screamed out to the administrators that maybe this was a terrible idea, but somehow they missed it. And this policy happened for 2 years before somebody had that picture and the media made this call to my co-author Thad and started calling around, and coverage eventually showed up everywhere about the school, and there was a potential ACLU lawsuit and the policy ended. But in the meantime, the principals who designed this whole structure did it kind of in the place of feeling these intense accountability pressures on them to try to compete. in this whole structure that, promoted achievement for them and put them, feeling like their jobs were at risk if they couldn't show improvements in achievement. And in fact, these principals were comparing themselves to principals in nearby districts and in this small district charter. And they felt like the kids in their school were so close to those kids, but were looked upon just a little bit worse because their API scores weren't quite as high. And so they felt like they needed to do something to motivate kids. And they were particularly worried about kids, not trying very hard, even though teachers had put in a bunch of effort to try to promote achievement. So one of the principals says the following about this whole thing. The CST means everything to the school, but nothing to the students. The SAT, the KC, professional licensure exams all have incentives for test takers. The California Standards Test does not. A pop quiz in home economics has more incentives for students. So he was really worried about promoting achievement for these kids, and he designed this structure with his co-principal in the other school to try to promote it. So we think that this policy, yes. I think that, so the ones that I'm thinking more of the PSAT, that you get a scholarship from that, but I don't know about the CST. Maybe, I don't know. That's a great question. I'm not sure about that. Well, it's definitely over because the CST is over. But maybe kids are still getting it though, because there's a couple of those later cohorts that are still, could have been eligible. So maybe this principle is not entirely right, is what you're saying. Okay, well, you might be right. But overall, apart from maybe the kids who are like right up at that perfect score threshold, he's especially worried about kids who are sleeping through the test, who are probably not at risk of getting one of those scholarships. So we think that this ID card policy, though flawed in important ways, also has important lessons that it can teach us about these kinds of incentive structures. So we have a couple of hypotheses about what the effects of this policy might be. First, exposure to this type of program and just having its presence in your school with all of the things that I've described so far could potentially increase achievement, particularly on the CST scores. And we think it would increase achievement more on CST scores because that's what he keeps honing in on rather than, say, grades or a high school exit exam. We also think that kids are really smart and they have a sense about how well they're doing on this test and how much more effort they might need to do in order to get that higher status card. So we think that the program probably has bigger incentives for kids who are kind of near the threshold. For kids who didn't do very well last year, even though they tried, we're not so sure that this kind of a policy would have a big effect on them because they don't feel like they actually have the chance of getting one of these rewards. But of course, you can already imagine some of the ways in which such a policy might have some negative effects as well. We think that there's the big possibility that losing out on getting a gold or platinum card could create some serious stigma for those kids who get white cards. And in fact, some records in the press suggest that that might be the case for at least some kids. One student who got a white card said the following: "It makes you feel dumb, like your school is putting you down." And it's not just that kids internalize messages about themselves, they also started policing them between each other. So for example, a platinum card honors student told a white card honors student the following: "Nobody with a white card should be in the honors program." So it didn't take very long for students to start internalizing the messages and then using them between each other. And in fact, administrators used this language too. We have a record of one of the administrators telling girls in one of his presentations that they should aspire to go to prom with the platinum card holder. So it kind of got worked in throughout the entire school structure, as cheesy as it starts to sound. And we think that this could have really important implications for some kinds of stigma, particularly because of the diversity and nature of the ways in which the cards were allocated. We think that the program incentives could have a greater positive effect for students who are positively stereotyped and potentially a negative effect for groups that are negatively stereotyped, and that people could respond particularly poorly if they feel like they're going to miss out. And then finally, we think it's possible that receiving a low status ID card might discourage students and might ultimately lead to them lowering their achievement, particularly if they just missed out on getting that gold card that they really apparently wanted based on this whole structure. So how are we going to look at this? Well, eventually, after a very long back and forth with the district, we got administrative records from them, but from 2007-8 to 11-12, and we have student level data that we can match to teachers and classrooms. And we have demographic information. It's pretty, the usual basic stuff like race, ethnicity, free and reduced lunch, EL status. We have some transcript data, so we can look at their GPAs. We can look at their math and ELA course enrollments and their grades and their test scores. Here's where, so we have ELA and math CSTs and KC, which is the high school exit exam. But here's where we're missing a couple pieces of key information. In high school, students can take up to 4 CST tests, and we have data from only 2 of them. So that's going to give us a couple of challenges in some of the analyses that I'll talk about later on. It's only because that's just what they provided to us. So unfortunately, that's kind of one of our big limitations, and we do a couple things to try to get around that, but keep that in mind going forward. And then, as I mentioned, this story was covered in the local paper and the local media. It was also covered in the students' school newspaper, so we draw some information from that about how the program was implemented. And then the principal in one of these 2 schools was so devoted to this policy that when it was undone by the school district, he wrote a memoir about it and self-published it on Amazon. So we drew some program details from that as well. You can't get it anymore. You'll have to borrow my copy if you're really curious. So I already sort of described a little bit about these schools and the district, but just to sort of highlight a few things for you. These are diverse schools in a fairly diverse district, but they don't entirely reflect what the other schools in the district look like. They don't totally resemble that. There's 3 main race ethnic groups, Hispanics, Asians, and whites. Asians are the largest group in these 2 schools, and certainly that doesn't entirely match what's happening in the other schools in Sudden Valley Unified, or the state of California. In general, Live Oak and Mann high schools are a little bit more advantaged than the other high schools in the district. And they are already fairly high-performing schools, as I mentioned. These are schools that are already doing okay. They're just really worried about their reputation more broadly and how they compare to schools outside of the district. So it's kind of interesting that that's the sort of place that this system would take hold for schools that are already fairly successful, but they really wanted to get into the 920s and 930s territory. So they felt like they needed to pull out all the stops to do that. And between the 2 schools, there's also some differences that are pretty notable in terms of who gets which kind of color card. Not even half of the students get the high status cards. So there's some amount of exclusivity involved there, which was sort of intentional on the part of the principals. And I think that Mann got more of the high status cards, but the bigger differences are really within the schools themselves. Clearly, Asian students are way more represented among the platinum card holders, and Hispanic students are much less likely to have those higher status cards. And this creates important distinctions, especially when you imagine those lunch lines. Males are slightly overrepresented among the high status cards, and the cards are definitely negatively associated with some of these other markers of social disadvantage. So in some sense, this whole structure could be perpetuating some kinds of inequalities that were already present in the school, just by virtue of designating higher status groups as the special elite gold and platinum holders. And just to show you what happened briefly in these 2 schools, between the pre-period and the post-period, there's a marked shift in terms of achievement, for example, on the ELA CST. The whole distribution kind of scoots over. And to the extent that there was a worry on the part of the principals that there were some kids taking a nap, it's possible that in the pre-period something like that was happening, and that they at least got kids at that very low margin to put in a little more effort, maybe. But most importantly, they got a lot more people to try a little harder. So that just gives you a quick snapshot of what we're looking at. So we're going to test our research questions with 2 different research designs. The first 3 will use a difference in differences design. We'll look at our outcomes, which are mostly test score outcomes and grades, and we'll have an indicator for being in Live Oak or Mann. We'll have indicators for the 3 years for which we have a current test score and a lag test score. 2010, which we call a transition year, when the program wasn't unrolled yet, but they used the test scores from that spring to determine who got ID cards the following fall. And then we have 2 program years in 2011 and 2012. And the coefficients that we're interested in are the interactions between those two, particularly in 2011 and 2012. So our 3 hypotheses are that the effects of this policy will be largest on the CST, but we might see positive effects on the CASI and in student grades. Those effects should be maybe largest near the threshold, and we define near threshold as within 25 points. We think the effects might be largest also for Asian and white students, and they'll definitely be larger than they are for Hispanic students. We're not entirely sure if we'll see positive or negative effects for Hispanic students, although we may. So yes? It's the other Sudden Valley Unified Schools. Yes, that's right. In this first design. In the next one, it'll just be within the same schools. That's a great question. Yes, we do know about school switching. There was actually less school switching both before the ID card period and after, in and out of Live Oak and Mann than any other Sudden Valley Unified schools. But it was pretty constant in the 2 time periods too. Do we assign people, meaning? When they took that test. So in the first year, they took the test in the spring, but the ID card policy didn't even exist yet. It didn't even come into place until the following fall. So I guess in that sense, looking at where they were before wouldn't entirely make sense because they didn't even know that they were going to be a part of it. It might. That's a good question. I'm trying to think about whether or not we did that. I know that for 9th graders, that also wouldn't make sense because they were in a middle school before. I'll have to go back and check about that. No, I think we used the place where they were in the fall. I mentioned that we have student level data for a couple of years, but we actually have CDE data that can give us some information about the trends going back farther that are just school level data. As I mentioned, these are fairly advantaged schools, and they were growing at a pace of about 3% a year in the pre-ID period. That's compared with a rate of about 2% per year for California and for the other control schools. And those schools maintain rates that are fairly similar around that during this transition and ID period. But our ID card schools kick up to an increase of a rate that's about 7% improvement per year in that time period. It's unfortunate that we don't have the student level data going back to that time period in this gray section, but at least looking at the trend can give us a sense that our time period is some sort of deviation from that prior trend when we can compare, when we do our comparisons just on this more limited data here. And when I zoom in on that and look at what the differences are, those ID schools already started at a substantial advantage in terms of where they were relative to the control schools. But the control schools stayed relatively flat with some minor improvements, whereas the ID card schools improved a fair bit on top of that. That was sort of above and beyond what would have been expected compared with these other comparison schools. This is ELA CST scores, but let me just put everything together onto one figure. So we looked at, back up, there we go. We looked at math and ELA scores. ELA are in blue, math are in gray. And we looked in the 2011 year and the 2012 year. 2011 is solid and 2012 is striped. Beyond the contemporaneous changes that were happening in the other Sudden Valley Unified High Schools. In English Language Arts, the students grew approximately 0.18, 0.19 standard deviations in those treatment years when they had the ID card program. And in math, they saw even larger gains that were closer to 0.3 standard deviations, just above. And that was on the CST test, which was previously low stakes for these students, but as a result of the ID card program, became incentivized, and apparently kids responded. And we also tested to see whether or not there was some sort of spillover into some of these other areas. Maybe students actually learned something from their efforts, and they didn't just try harder. And we see at least a little bit of evidence that it spilled over onto the exit exam, which was the CASE. In English Language Arts, maybe in one year, but not in the other years, and certainly not in math. There's also some evidence of some changes that are happening with grades in English Language Arts. We can't totally disentangle whether or not this was actually an effect in terms of students learning more things or teachers deciding particular students had more skills and so they rewarded them because they had the ID card, or if it was because there was a provision in this whole policy that encouraged teachers to change grades retroactively if students scored at above those proficiency thresholds to get them into gold or platinum cards. We heard that was part of the provision. I mean, it's written into some of the documentation we have, but we also see that the correlations between grades and test scores are pretty consistent in the pre and the post periods for which we have data. So we're not entirely sure what to make of that. And it's also sort of hard to decide because it happened in English Language Arts, but not in math. So we don't know if it's just that the English teachers really responded to this and the math teachers thought it was not a good thing to do or what was going on there, but suffice it to say, we can't explain the mechanisms, but we can at least say something happened here even to impact grades. Did you have a question? It totally could be, yeah. I mean, we have no reason to think that it wouldn't be even, yeah. Yes, that's right. That's right, yes. Oh. Okay. Okay, I might ask you about where to find that after this, because that would be a neat extension for this. We have continued to try to talk to this district, and we've worked with them on some other things, and we want to get data for these kids at the end of high school, but that might be an easier way around it since they've been kind of slow in getting back to us. Of course, yeah, but that's a good way to try to triangulate, yeah. Yes. Not exactly in the way that you're asking about, though, but so let me just tell you what the next two are. So we looked at it for kids who were close to the threshold versus far below versus far above. And this is near the threshold is within 25 points on either side of moving in the margin from white to gold. The well below kids are below 25 points or lower below that, and the well above kids are above 25 points from that threshold. So obviously, it had this pattern that we were sort of expecting from our hypothesis, which was that the kids near the threshold in those schools with the ID cards in Live Oak and Mann had gains that exceeded those seen for kids near those same thresholds in the non-ID card schools in those same years. Even some of the well below kids seem to exert some additional effort, which we found a little bit surprising, more in math than in language arts. And then the well above kids, we assume what happens there is that either they're really close to the ceiling anyway, which is true for some but not all of those kids, or they just feel assured that they're going to get the high status card anyway, so they don't need to exert extra effort. So that hypothesis is somewhat confirmed. They could be the NAP guys, yes. Yes. They could be the NAP guys, and they could, I mean, having sat for many similar to CST tests myself, like some of them are not, some pieces of them could be challenging for some students, but for a lot of students, bubbling A, B, C, D, and suddenly not doing that and maybe trying to answer some questions could, you know, make a pretty substantial difference too. So we also looked at differences by race ethnicity to try to test for evidence of stereotype threat or stereotype lift. Across the board in math, students benefited from this policy, but Asian students benefited the most. Although tests, you know, comparing individual coefficients within years, I think the only one that is actually significantly different is this one for Asians in 2011 and the one for Hispanics, where if anything, you know, there's a significant gap. Whites and Asians in English language arts might have improved slightly as a result of this policy, but Hispanic students, that's not significantly different from zero. Essentially, they didn't, nothing bad happened to them in the presence of the policy, but they didn't experience the gains that everyone else did in English language arts. So while it wasn't entirely fundamental, it did widen inequalities between groups that we care about, and having that reinforced is potentially problematic for some of the social makeup of this school.
I don't know if your sample size will allow it, but if you can break it up by where they fell in the distribution, so essentially break it out by the previous slide and ethnicity,
Yes.
to see if there are differential effects.
We did do that. And I don't think that there was anything particularly notable about their relative place in the distribution, where we basically combined the previous one and this one, right? And ran the three-way interactions. Yeah, no, we didn't find anything there that was, that suggested that the relative placement within these groups had any differential effects. Yeah. And gender. We did do that. But I can't remember the results. I'll have to go back and pull those up. Yeah, exactly. I mean, we don't have a great reason to think why this policy, apart from the kind of weirdly, potentially misogynistic language used by the principal, why it would more closely target men or women in particular. But I guess if you're worried about stereotype threat, you might worry that women, especially those who are far from the threshold, might feel stigmatized in the presence of this. Oh, okay. I got you. Okay. I'll have to get back to you on that. I don't actually remember off the top of my head. So then finally, we want to look at what happened within these two high schools, and if having the stigma of getting a white card had any kinds of consequences that were different for those students. So here we'll use a binding score regression discontinuity design. We'll look at those same set of dependent variables. We're also going to add suspensions as one of our dependent variables. I'm going to focus on 10th graders in particular here because we have both language arts, CST scores and KC scores, although the samples will shift around to include and exclude the 9th, 10th, and 12th graders, depending. So I'll try to highlight where the samples are slightly different. And we're going to think about what students' lowest prior year CST was, and that being just below the threshold is what we're going to be interested in. We've done versions of these models where we did and didn't include covariates, where we did and didn't include grade fixed effects, where we did a whole bunch of other robustness checks that I'll talk about coming up. And the results are pretty consistent. There's a little variation if you get really far from the threshold or really close in, but overall the patterns that I'm going to talk about kind of hold across various model specifications. So first, one of the things, of course, we're worried about is that there's some kind of gaming and that teachers or students somehow know that this policy is coming and they want to get over the threshold. I mean, there's potential to think about that anyways because kids and teachers care maybe about getting up to proficient or advanced anyway, so there's some kind of motivation there. We definitely have evidence of like heaps at different places, but it's not so much that there's like one heap right above the threshold that we worry about entirely, and then the McCrary density test is really smooth across the threshold. We also have balance on all of the covariates that we have from baseline, including race, ethnicity, the EL proficiency, the whether or not they moved or changed schools, the free and reduced price lunch. The only place where we do see some differences is there's more boys above the threshold than we might have expected from chance, which is what made me pause about thinking whether there were effects specific for boys, but I don't remember, So the next question then is, what's the effect of having this ID card policy and having a test score that's on one side of the threshold or the other on what kind of card you get? So this version of the first stage is estimated with Stata's RD canned software, and I'm going to show you a different figure in a minute because I don't like this one, but it is the one that's going to appear in the paper. So, so I got overruled by my co-authors on that one. But the things that I want to highlight here are first that there is this really big jump, obviously, at the threshold. These are kids whose lowest score on math or ELA is below the 350, which is the centered score, and these are kids whose lowest score is above. But there isn't entirely perfect compliance here either in terms of what cards people get. So let me unpack that for a minute. There are, I think, 3 reasons why, and a couple of them we deal with, and one of them we test in a couple of ways, but we can't entirely manage with some of the data limitations we have. So first, there are 2 additional provisions to this ID card policy that I haven't talked about yet. The first one is a growth clause. They wanted to really inspire some of those low-performing nap takers to try to improve and make really big gains. So they put in a growth clause that if you grew more than, at least one performance band from one of those really low ones, they would actually bump you right up to a gold card. And we have a couple hundred kids who grew to a gold card for that reason, and that's some of these kids around over here. We'll eliminate those guys from our analyses that I'm going to show you here because of the growth provision. There's also a provision for these guys where if you were all proficient and advanced in the previous year and you dropped one performance band, you actually went all the way down to a white card, even if the rest of your scores would have entitled you to still have a gold card. We call that the fall from grace provision. We are thinking about looking into that a little bit more, but there were about 300 kids for whom that happened. And we eliminate them from our analyses here too, because we're not so sure what they otherwise have all the markers of being these higher performing kids, but they, because of their fall down to the white card, have a little bit of a different experience with this threshold. And then finally, there's a remaining group whose lowest test score is potentially not in math or English language arts. It's probably in science or social studies. And we don't have those data that are matched to ID cards. We got another pull of data from the district at a different time where we could confirm approximately the percentages of kids whose lowest test scores were science and social studies. But those are kids who were in the district from 8th grade, and so we are missing a few of them. But that makes up a good portion of this gap in our first stage. So we actually think that adherence to the rules about ID cards was followed pretty strictly. So even though this first stage implies something like 55 to 60 percentage point gap, we actually think it's closer to 90 to 95%. So just keep that in mind when you see any of the results from the second stage. If you're thinking about scaling up those results to get a treatment on the treated estimate, don't scale it up as much as you would based on what's implied here, because we actually think that that they really did follow the rules. We just don't entirely have complete data to follow it. And so in case you like these kind of pictures better, which I do, you can see that the gap is pretty consistent here. And when we try it with a bunch of different bandwidths, it moves around a little bit. But the gap remains roughly between, around the 0.6 margin. But as I just explained, we think that that this line should really be way up there when we include the test scores that we don't actually possess matched to IDs. So what kind of an effect did actually getting a gold card, or maybe not getting a gold card is probably the better way to put it, have on students in the following year. This picture, again, I think downplays it, but we see at this threshold a gap in the following year. And this axis is in the hundreds, so this gap is actually 20 points, which is 0.35 standard deviations, which is a pretty big downturn for some of those students near the threshold. And if you want to see it zoomed in a little bit and in a format that we are a little more familiar with, you can see, not all, but a lot of these points near the threshold are falling down and are pretty low. So we think that it adversely impacted students' efforts in the following year. And not just on the test that was incentivized, or for these students, disincentivized potentially as a result of these cards. So as I mentioned, there's there's different samples happening in some of these because we have different numbers of students with different kinds of tests, but vaguely in the 0.5 to 0.6 range from there. And we see negative impacts on the ELA CST, the ELA exit exam, really big negative effects on their grades, in part because so many of these kids, I think I wrote down the number, it was like 30% of the kids who just missed out then had a failing grade in English language arts the following year. We don't see as much happening on math in the test scores, but we do also in math grades. We see suspensions trending in the positive direction. Suspensions are still really rare in this school, so it's not significant. So maybe don't read too much into this, but the direction is at least in the sense that there was maybe a negative impact that trickled over into some other areas too. Yeah.
I'm trying to figure out if this is I did bad, so I'm demotivated, versus I got a white card and they were treating me poor in school, and that's what I'm responding to.
Mm-hmm.
And if they were given information look, here's your 4 scores, and your lowest one is 349, you just missed out.
Yeah.
And to me, that would be less of a demotivating thing and more of a treat of schools.
Yeah. Well,
How they were given this information.
so every year kids get a score report sent home, right? So kids, even in these non-ID card schools, had access to this information, and so did teachers, and they all kind of get it at the same time, sometime around August or September. What is less clear is if they had a formal meeting in which they then saw their scores at some later time and were given a white card. I don't think that actually happened. It's not clear to me if they had formal discussions with teachers at some points where the kids could go in and say I'm really close to this threshold. What do I do? I don't know about that. No, when they pick up their schedules on the first day of school, they also get their card and planner. They sit down for their picture and then they give them the card. So there is a public thing that happens in the presence of an adult, but I'm not sure that there's a formal discussion that happens in that process that says guess you got a 349. I don't know about that.
I don't really understand why you just interpret this as the effect of the negative effect of receiving the white card, right? But also the positive effect of receiving gold card for this.
It could be. Apart from the fact that you don't see a kick up near the threshold for the gold kids, and you do see a kick down on the other side.
Yeah, no, that's true. But I wonder if you combine this again with the
Diff and diff.
design, whether you can actually get this a little bit more.
Maybe. Yeah. Yeah, because in general, this whole school is kind of shifting up. It's just these guys are. The above the threshold kids are shifting more, and these guys are just maybe not shifting at all. That's possible. But I think we looked at that, and I think that these guys didn't do that shift up that the other guys did. But I'll have to go back and confirm.
Why would the guy, if I'm next to the threshold in the lost, but why the guy behind would go up?
Why? No, the people in front of the threshold went up, not the people.
The whole school went out.
The dip, yeah.
A little bit motivated by questions of why would people with lower scores better than the high scores? Just correlations.
Right.
If I know we're close, I would think I would be less responsive to the treatment.
Well, so they do know where the threshold is, and they could infer based on what their report is how close to the threshold they are. I mean, what we see is that those kids who are near the threshold actually do fall off more than the kids who are a little bit behind them, who are farther from the threshold. So that's why we're interpreting it as like the negative impact of being just below, as opposed to the positive impact of being above. But although it could be partially also a positive impact of being above.
Go back to the graph.
Yep.
Because the line that you fit doesn't really takes them into account, but reflects more like how it puts more weight on the ones that don't seem to curve down.
To curve down as much?
So it seems that even if you would not, like if you would do a donut hole, right?
Yep.
You'd still see a similar effect
Yeah.
without those that kind of curve downwards. That's
Without these right here. I mean, we've done, yes, we do see a similar effect without that very close in. I'd have to think about how far out that effect ends up being. I don't know that it's not maybe just within the first 1 or 2 points that kids are falling off.
yeah, this kind of just makes me think about like how, like what is that, like,
Yeah, well, if you have more ideas about it, that's probably useful for us to think about more. So let's chat more about it later, yeah. Yeah.
Let's grab multiple rating scores. Did you analyze this
Um,
because I could imagine that how far you are
on both influenced your performance kind of across or, right,
far away on one and not the other. That's different.
right. Right, that's true. That's a good question. I think we only focused on whichever was your lowest score, but we could think about doing it. It's been a little while since we did some of those. I mean, I think we looked at whether or not if your lowest score was in ELA, did that more strongly impact ELA stuff next year or math stuff next year, which is kind of getting at what you're asking, but maybe isn't exactly. And we just see kind of different patterns for ELA and math in general, with most of the effects concentrated in ELA. I'll have to think about that a little bit more to remember exactly what we did to differentiate between whether it was a math or an ELA lowest score. But I think we did look at the match between what your effort or your performance was on the matching test in the subsequent year.
And also, they get their scores mailed home to them, so even though they might not have gotten talked about.
That's right. Yes, right. That's what I was saying. Yeah, the only thing that's different here is that there's this whole system around it that was made public and that gets reinforced. Everyone else, teachers and students and principals, had the opportunity to see these scores before. And certainly in schools like these with kind of strong accountability pressures for improvement, it's not like people ignored scores altogether. But certainly principals and teachers talked about them. Whether or not families opened the envelopes and looked at scores and thought about what they meant, or if they just threw them away, is unclear. Yeah. Okay, so to Oded's question, we tried, not quite to your question, but Hans's question. We tried a bunch of different configurations where we moved in and out the bandwidth. We started with the optimal bandwidth from the Emmons and Kalyanaraman optimal bandwidth procedure, but we tried a bunch of different ones. We were doing triangular kernels because we were kind of concerned about the relative weighting of those kids really close. We did rectangular kernels to try to not give too much weight to those really close to the threshold kids. We did bandwidths, we picked, I guess, very specific bandwidth. We did a donut. And we see reasonably consistent patterns. The magnitudes swing around a fair bit, but the kind of trend of negative impacts on ELA scores and grades, and some negative impacts on math grades are both consistent. Suspension stays non-significant, though in the positive direction. And then I told you that we had this other source of data where we couldn't match the test scores onto the ID cards, but we could at least kind of look at what rates would be if we, in the presence of all 4 scores. And that's what's happening here. We're looking in, among the kids who were there in 8th grade who we got from this other data pull, what would the second stage have looked like if we had all 4 scores. So it's pretty consistent in the ELA exit exam. If anything, kind of more at the margin of significance with ELA, but these are smaller samples and it's a little noisier too. But that gives us confidence at least that even only having 2 of the scores that help with the ID card assignment, we're kind of matching what it would have been if we would have had the complete data available, although we can't get the first stage here, obviously. So we did, I think I mentioned that we did a bunch of different thresholds. We also tried placebos, and we didn't find any evidence of any kinds of jumps at other thresholds. We did a couple of different donut RDs. I showed one. We did another where we took out like really obvious heaps of test scores, although in the CST they kind of try to smooth it, so that's maybe not so surprising. And we look in the non-ID card schools in Sudden Valley Unified, and we don't see the same pattern of effects. So this is a place where there are incentives around getting kids from basic to proficient, but it takes apparently the infusion of social status and the public nature of that infusion to have this kind of impact. So we have obviously some limitations. You guys have highlighted a few, but I'll just talk about a few more. We have a small number of treated schools. This was implemented in a single district, although I'll get to that in a minute. I want to circle back to that. We are also missing science and social studies, so we can't fully validate everything, particularly related to the first stage. And then our effects are for kids near the proficiency cutoff for white cards. We don't know if the same kind of set of incentives were implemented for much lower performing kids if we would have seen similar responses. So this is like a one-off thing, but it had kind of dramatic effects. But more generally, why do we care? Because it's in the past, it ended, and they've moved on. Well, it's potentially not all that uncommon, actually. We found out about this particular case, but I'm going to talk about a couple more in just a second. But it also highlights some of the strengths and weaknesses of accountability and the kinds of pressures that maybe we feel comfortable putting onto schools to try to motivate behavior. Maybe we feel okay about putting it onto teachers sometimes, but it feels a little more uncomfortable putting it onto students, especially in this really public way that maybe students can internalize. But it's also an interesting test of status characteristics theory beyond the lab. Kids took on these identities, and then they really quickly, even though they were kind of arbitrary at this particular cutoff, started enforcing them amongst one another pretty quickly in the span of 2 years. And then this is, of course, a case that helps us better understand the ways in which prizes can contribute to categorical inequality or maybe even create it. Is this a solitary case? Well, there's a company that probably most of you who've grown up in the United States are familiar with, Jostens. They take those ugly yearbook photos. They give you those really big class rings. They maybe gave you your graduation cap and gown. But they also have designed this program called the Jostens Renaissance Program. And when you start to hear about Renaissance programs that are implemented around the United States, it starts to sound eerily familiar. And maybe those two principles got some inspiration from some other place. We don't know that for sure. But some of the other Jostens Renaissance programs have express lunch lines or give away lunch line passes. Some of them have a special cafe for elite test takers. They get breakfast served by teachers, while the other kids don't. They have a policy called You've Been Carded, where administrators can come up to you, and if you're holding your card, they might give you a prize. They have academic signing days all over the place. They give school events discounts. They give local business discounts. They do mentoring things related to these cards. And they even have events related to testing where they roll out the red carpet for students to run up at the start of testing on the first day, where teachers cheer and stuff. All kinds of interesting things. So Sheldon High School is one of these places, and they have a lot of the same kinds of things related to their gold, silver, and blue card program. they focus their incentives related to GPA rather than test scores, but they're trying to motivate the same kind of behavior, and they're trying to create a very similar social structure. Delsey Middle School has a Renaissance card program, and they think about 82 points in every marking period. That gets you admittance to get a gold card for the Renaissance program. And once, when I was presenting this paper, I had a friend come up to me and say, oh yeah, my daughter's class has something like that too, and she's in first grade. And in first grade, they have this tracker for tracking progress on accelerated reader, and as they reach some sort of threshold for books they've read or something like that, they move up the rainbow, and then they get a new wristband to go with what rainbow level they are. So we kind of build this structure in everywhere, and this poor kid Bethany might feel not so great about still being at the purple band level. So this is one of the paradoxes that this policy and this paper kind of highlights related to accountability. It's similar to incentives that we use for schools and administrators and teachers, but now it's down at the kid level. And now we're trying to promote their behaviors in ways that we might like, but we might also be invoking some social things for those students that we might not like so much. And the thing about this policy, and one of the reasons that one principal wrote that memoir, was because from their perspective, it worked. Their achievement on average increased. And in this loosely coupled system where the principals didn't have a lot of authority to get kids better, simply creating this social structure and promoting kids to try hard to get a gold and a platinum card helped their school bump their API up and made their school look better in the eyes of other principals and prospective parents. But at the same time, this set of policies reinforced educational inequalities. It helped to draw upon existing distinctions that were already present in the school, and then it made them more salient in a new way, but it also reinforced some of the things that were already happening. It added a whole level of status and stigma to this school. There's been lab experiments on status characteristics theory that talk about how quickly people will take on identities if you assign them to people. Think about experiments like Pygmalion in the classroom or in Brown Eyes, Blue Eyes, and how quickly people will refer to other children or adults as in their same group or not. And that seems to be a little bit what happened in the culture here in this particular school. And we think, it also could have impacted teachers' perceptions of students. We saw some of the largest RD estimates on student grades, which could have been wrapped up in what teachers were inferring about kids based on kids having a gold or a platinum card too. So the prizes in this particular setting make us think a little bit about some of the literature. Bourdieu talks about a rite of initiation where you confer status onto someone in the middle of a dubbing ceremony for a night, and you basically tell them, you are important. And by giving kids ID cards, they're publicly imposing an identity on a kid and saying, you are a gold card kid, and you're not. You're a white card kid. And that can have an important implication for students' identity and as we see, potentially their future performance. Benyabu and Tirole's looking glass self-reference also applies here. We see students adjusting their effort based on their likely or their presumed likelihood of getting a card and then responding to the fact that maybe they didn't get the card or maybe they did. So even though we tend to think of some of these social incentives as cost-free, they aren't necessarily. This kind of status is sort of zero-sum. I mean, in this particular case, not entirely all kids could have gotten a gold card, but ultimately having it be something exclusive and giving rewards to some and not others was part of the structure in this incentive program. So there were consequences for the kids who won, who got gold and platinum cards, and the kids who lost. And that gave the students inferred signals from that and modified their effort. And that maybe reinforced prior identities or created new ones. So in both loose and tight coupling systems, there's costs and benefits. I think I said this already, but prizes are not necessarily cost-free. But one thing that this highlighted for us and for organizational scholars more generally who talk a lot about these kinds of distinctions is that regression discontinuity is a good way to test some of those theories. And that sociologists, we were surprised to find out, well, maybe not so surprised to find out, maybe you're not surprised at all, don't use this method at all in most of their work to try to test some of these theories that they've developed. We're publishing this in a sociological journal, but we had a hard time finding one that had actually published a regression discontinuity study before. So we have some future directions, which is why the comments are really helpful. We have some disciplinary data that we're going to try to dig into a little bit more, and we're working on trying to get longer-term outcomes, including college attendance, so that we can follow these kids in the future. And then we're really curious about those kids who fell from grace from platinum to white, especially interested in following them up in the long term to figure out if some of those adverse consequences from the social stigma of potentially not being like their similarly achieving peers had any kinds of implications for them. And then finally, we don't want to confine this just to some of the administrative data that we have access to. We're actually sending a grad student to the Renaissance Conference, where they roll out this policy every year, and they bring administrators to get revved up for the coming school year of motivating their students through the use of status incentives and ID cards. This one was last year, but we're sending someone to the 25th annual program that's coming up in Florida in July. So this ID cards project was something that just fell into our laps. It was something that was happening in a nearby school. But it's one of these policies that it seems like people in many different settings are thinking about implementing. And to the extent that it has positive effects, that's worth knowing about. But to the extent that it could also be having negative effects, or at least creating inequalities between groups of students in ways that we don't like, that's also really worth knowing about. And this ID card program, with its many flaws, was useful for sort of illuminating some of those contrasts for us. So I'm done really early, but I want to thank you guys for sticking it out with me. I want to thank NICHD, Spencer, IES, IRIS, and of course SEPA for having me. Thanks, you guys.